Yeah, thank you very much for your inspiring words. Well, there's obviously a large gap between protests and another world, a better world, yeah. And not much room for optimism, if I understood you well. Okay. Our first respondent is the host of this institution, who I probably needn't introduce to anybody, but if there is any, let me say some words. Florian, since he's been a professor here at the Center for Southeast European Studies, has unfolded an amazing range of activities and nudged fruitful debates, holds his lectures, blogs, invites eminent scholars from all over the world, so that one can hardly believe that his day has got only 24 hours. He studied at Trinity College in the USA and in Vienna, where he also obtained his PhD, and he worked in Belgrade and Sarajevo, as well as at the European Center for Minority Issues, and later taught at the universities of Kent, Cornell, Bologna, and Sarajevo. And in former times, one would have said his word is heard in high places, but maybe he can tell us whether there is still any such thing as a high place in this world. Okay.
It's maybe they're not listening because, as Norbert knows, I wrote something in advice for the Balkan Machiavelli, as a Balkan Machiavelli for the Balkan princes, and I still haven't gotten the job offer to provide them with advice. So maybe well, I know they read them actually. Some of them have commented on it.
So they're not high places.
Yes, I guess so. But it's of course a very hard act to follow on Ivan's comments he made, which I think have been really very much overlap with thinking we've been having a number of events here in Graz about the protest movements both in Southeastern Europe and putting them in a larger context just recently in comparison of Bosnia, Bulgaria, Brazil and Turkey. Let me begin with a few observations. Again, I would like to try to put it in the Southeast European context, which Ivan has put in a larger global context. And then also bring in the dimension of universities to some degree, because that is one of the focuses of this lecture series. Now, I think the first observation is that the difficulty of characterizing, is it a call for global success of the crisis of capitalism, or is it the success of capitalism? I think this is a nice dichotomy, and I would try to offer a resolution of it by suggesting that many of these protests, maybe not all of them, are centered on the loss of the commons, the idea of a common space, of course, the grazing ground in medieval British villages, but of course today usually not a grazing ground for cattle or other livestock, but rather often parks. And it is striking how many of the protests have centered around the destruction of public spaces, whether it's in Istanbul or in Banja Luka, for example, or the same symbolic common spaces, so the erosion of them. And I think there we find a way to reconcile both protests which are explicitly not coming from, let's say, a leftist perspective, which criticize government for corruption, but at the same time, of course, that corruption destroys these common spaces. But it's also, in some cases, a critique of capitalism, because, again, also capitalism, or particular types of capitalism, can destroy these common spaces. So I think that is a way to conceptualize the kind of sometimes seemingly diverse images of these protests. Now, the second point where I think Ivan's observations, I would fully subscribe to that, we're talking about a reflection of a crisis of representative democracy. And what is striking is that many of these protests, not all of them, of course, take place in democracies of different types. Some of them what we would consider to be consolidated democracies, and some of them democracies with an authoritarian strain, but certainly electoral democracies, and the skepticism of citizens that democratic institutions can resolve the problems they consider to be important. And I think the observation that Southeastern Europe has been maybe pioneering in this the phenomena of ideological sameness or the lack of ideological distinction between parties has been more pronounced maybe than elsewhere, exactly because of European integration. That is, in a certain way, the paradox that European integration, despite its beneficial effects, has resulted in a situation where everybody's European in their ideology. Nobody behaves European or what is supposed to be EU standards in their practice, because they have discovered, many political elites have discovered in Southeastern Europe, it is sufficient to talk the talk and do just as much necessary not to come under too much scrutiny. So in that sense, maybe Southeastern Europe has been pioneering in this particular dynamics. Now, there are two observations I want to make. One thing which strikes me, and maybe this is just for discussion, is that there's also, with any protest movements, there is, to be successful, there has to be the assumption that they represent a majority. Now, of course, you never have a majority of citizens on the street. You always have a minority. But that for that minority to be successful, it has to resonate and has to have a credible claim to represent a larger majority. And I think this is the challenge with some of these protests, that they are confronted with at least the ability of other groups to challenge this claim to be representing a majority. I mean, Bulgaria is a nice story because you have the two waves of protests with very different constituencies. But also in the case of Turkey, you have a party which remains very popular. So elections actually are a way to show that the protesters are not representing a majority. And this is the same in Bosnia, of course, where elections a few months after last year's protests brought just a reconfiguration of the same parties rather than a change of the overall political dynamic. So there's that sense that there is this kind of silent majority which sometimes is mobilized. And, you know, yesterday in Skopje was mobilized by the government with some success to show that, again, the protesters of the day before are just part of the public space but not represent a majority. And that is, of course, for incumbents extremely important, because they can only counter the power of street protests if they can make a plausible claim that this is just a political party or just a minority. So how do they do that? And I think there are two elements which are important. I think this is the role of clientelism, and I think this is one thing which is part of the puzzle, is that if you have parties which are indistinct by ideology, why vote for one party or the other? Well, you vote for parties because they offer you more benefits. And I think there's some nice ethnographic research in Bosnia which highlights how people make choices for parties based on, how much money they offer or what employment they offer. And we have the same phenomena throughout Southeastern Europe, where lots of political party choices are based on personal preferences. And they are, in fact, quite credible and quite plausible, because, indeed, if the parties are indistinguishable ideologically, if they are all pro-European, but you know they're all corrupt and clientelistic, well, why not vote for the one which is pro-European but also offers your dad a job or your friend a job or you 50 euros? It seems like a very useful bargain. So, of course, this creates networks of people who have a vested interest, not in the party as party supporters, but just, from a practical business side. You have a job, or your friend has a job. If the party loses power, they lose the job, because that's the way it works. So you don't want that party to lose power, because and as long as parties are able to sustain this, it is very hard to break the back of this mechanism. And the suspicion, the plausible suspicion of everybody is that the new party would be the same. So there's, in most of, and I think this is also why it has not translated into party votes, because most voters expect the other parties to behave exactly the same way, just that they are maybe even worse because they have to make up for the years they've been out of power. So, they have to catch up with the theft the other ones have already done and gotten over with. So this is, I think, one of the questions of how to challenge that. But the second one is also that when we assume that this is a crisis of representative democracy, then also one has to not assume that any support for other forms, let's say, of direct democracy are inherently progressive or challenging the status quo. So, in fact, they might be also quite conservative. So we find that, if I bring the example of Croatia, where the one, successful example of direct democracy has been that to enshrine a constitutional ban on gay marriages by saying that marriage is defined as a partnership of a man and a woman, and the initiative now to ban the use or make the use of the Cyrillic alphabet very difficult, are examples where you actually find a conservative counter-mobilization which is actually more successful than a liberal one. And so we find that actually the crisis of representative democracy does not necessarily go in favor of a more open political system, but maybe one which is even more conservative. Now let me conclude with two observations about higher education, how to locate that within this larger point. First one is student protest, because of course students are key actors in protest movements throughout. And if you look at Southeastern Europe in recent years, we've seen student protests re-emerging, and there was a long gap, really, where I would say there was the 90s, a period where students protested mostly for democracy in authoritarian, semi-authoritarian systems. And Jessica Greenberg, an American anthropologist, has studied this very nicely in the case of Serbia, how basically the first generation after the fall of Milosevic was exhausted. They had been on the streets for 10 years. They were done. They didn't want to protest anymore. They were in fact exhausted already before. They'd given it one last push in 2000 and were successful. But there was no more mobilization in Serbia, and we don't see it even today. And in many other countries, it only began years later when new generations of students mobilized, and very often distancing themselves from the previous ones who had been the democratic entrepreneurs. Because they actually were often very critical. The new protests are very critical of Bologna, of the perceived commodification of our education. So they propose very different critique of the system than the previous generation did. They are post-national sometimes, or post in a certain way. Their main goal is not democratization, but actually challenging the European integration process and what has happened afterwards. But the question which comes there is, and this is what we've seen also in Macedonia, where we've had student protests in recent months, is that these protests are unlikely to be successful if they're not able to connect with a larger part of the population. And this is, of course, an older story of protest movements, that student protest movements, have historically often been, very strong but unsuccessful if they can be ignored by political elites, because they don't represent, again, a broad constituencies. And I think here we find the phenomena where they are still seen as elites or a population which is not representative of a broader citizens group. And the challenge arises from the fact that there is a significant elite gap in many of the countries where elites are distrusted in general, and thus students are distrusted by large parts of the population in general. And with, in fact, the development of social structures in the last 25 years, this has been more accentuated. And this is my last observation. The interesting observation thinking about this topic and the protest is, of course, I want to conclude with the rise of private universities in Southeastern Europe, which is an interesting kind of addendum to that, because we have Southeastern Europe is particular for the large number of private for-profit universities, which is different, of course, from the North American model of non-profit universities, which also is actually an example of the loss of the commons, because if you are a client who pays a private enterprise for your degree, you are not going to protest over tuition, because this is, you're engaging in a business relationship. You're not going to demonstrate in a bank because you're paying bank fees, right? So it reduces the protest potential in the countries, and it also buys students into often a corrupt relationship where we're saying we pretend we teach you and you pretend you learn, but the only thing we do is you pay us and we give you a diploma at the end of the day. This is of course not universal to all private higher education institutions, but there is a good number of them which are candidates, and we find governments actually quite keen to support this. And I've been kind of thinking about why are governments eager to support private institutions, and it's partly, of course, because they provide the vanity factor that many politicians have acquired degrees in incredible speed, like the Minister of Interior of Serbia, who's got his PhD while running the Serbian parliament at the same time, which is, of course, for all of us quite an accomplishment. or the president of Serbia who got his master's degree while being in opposition and published a few academic papers recently. This is, quite an accomplishment. So it might feed into the vanity factor, but it also has this demobilizing factor that private universities are a way to have a docile student and also academic community, which actually suits this kind of, it can come under the framework of de-ideologized, capitalist, commodified education, but in the end actually is conducive to support kind of authoritarian tendencies and destroy a public and a common, which is necessary for that kind of critical debate. So.
Yeah, thank you very much.